So we've got about an hour here where Rowe and I will be chatting. My name's Brenna, I'm a permaculture educator and illustrator. And after that, we'll be invited to move outside, grab a bowl of soup, and Rowe will be able to circulate, sign some books. We'll have the shop open again for those who didn't grab a book earlier who would like to. So Rowe, have a seat.
Thank you.
To get started, I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from Rowe's book. I stand on the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, known as the Fertile Crescent. It's a place that was once so productive that nomadic tribes could settle and store surplus food, with the leisure to develop the myriad of crafts, technology and arts that brought us here today. The ancient poets used to write of green glades, fresh air, running water and abundant fruits. Willows overhung deep pools, fish swam in permanent rivers and birds sang. Lost in my mind's images, I open my eyes to the reality. Before me is a flat, dusty land, a refugee camp of 50,000 people, and there's not a tree in sight. Shifting sands cover everything. The climate here vacillates between extremes of minus 10 degrees Celsius in winter and an unbearable 50 degrees in summer. The Tigris, a wide, tired river, now barely flows to the sea due to the failure of snowmelt to feed it. Here I am in the once fertile crescent, helping people grow food under incredibly difficult conditions. So begins the introduction, and it ends with, there's nothing presently available which is like permaculture and which is based on a design and systems approach. My conviction from evidence is that permaculture can transform lives to buffer climate change, build community resilience, and improve the future. The best gift for our children is a world restored. This is an incredibly exciting and important book and so relevant for the times in which we're living. Rowe?
Brenna.
I had a rummage on the Fair Harvest bookshelf and found this, the Earth User's Guide to Permaculture, published in 1993, first edition. Comparing it to the current edition that we're talking about tonight, it's quite a bit smaller. Is there extra content in this new book?
There are some blank pages for people to scribble on. Look, thank you all for coming tonight. I'm sure you had dinner and children and things to do, and Sunday evening, things to prepare for tomorrow. I just love it if you just say hello to the person next to you, especially if you don't know them. Just a quick hello. You probably do. I think you were a community who all knew each other. Sorry, let me think about the question. Great.
Will it work?
Yeah, it will.
Doesn't work.
Right. Well, thank you, Brenna. Because that's a really hard question. I have to think what happened over that 30 years that the book got so thick and it seemed to grow itself. And a lot of things happen. Permaculture seems fairly simple. You're just dealing with soil and water and climate and microclimate and economics and ethical money and land tenure and access to land and, you know, just a few more, about another 20 chapters. And then as you go into it, each one of those gets deeper and more profound. At the same time, although the topics haven't changed, the amount of information that's available to us has changed immensely. And the quantity of certain information. So in '93, we were full of climate deniers. Heading into 2023, I don't hear the word very much. There are a few, but they also believe in the flat earth and possibly some other things as well. So I'm not sure about that, but the thing is that permaculture has now become really quite deep and continuous and overlaid, so the systems and the links in the subjects are quite profound. Let me give you an example. In 1993, we said you decide climate by looking at the maximum number of years you can of records and averaging them. So we come up with the Mediterranean climate for Western Australia, where it's hot, dry summers, fairly cold, wet winters, reliable, the rains start, and it's all, the planting seasons are right. Now we're saying, look at the last 30 years and average them, because they will give you the variability and the extremes that are not there if you average 100 years. I'm not sure if that's clear. Would you like me to say it again or a bit differently? If you take the shorter period, it won't be as certain, but it will show you the unpredictability of climate that's happening more clearly than taking a longer period. So we're saying to people now, look at 30 years. Take your highest, your lowest, your latest rain, your biggest drought, and feed those in. And you're coming up for a different world which is less predictable. It's that sort of thing that's come into permaculture and given us more evidence. With regard to climate as well, we now know definitively it's the oceans, that's 70%, which is deciding climate almost more than anything else. Through the currents, through the winds, and things we never talked about were the air-water interface. We just talked about air comes on land and then it brings it on and it rains and the land's hot and the wet air flows in. Now we know, and that's because of increased monitoring, everything from satellites to monitors in the sea to monitoring animals and fish. And we know that the great producer of oxygen in the world has been the oceans. Absolutely. And the way it's done it, it has absorbed carbon dioxide. And we know it's nearly absorbed its maximum. And as it does, it becomes acid and warmer. We know things, they're not pleasant to know, but they are tools we can use moving into the future if we want decent strategies. So we have a lot more knowledge to put into permaculture than we had in 1993. And because I was lucky enough to start permaculture from what they called then development base, so I'd spent 4 years in Lesotho in Africa and then in India, and then it went on, and then I chose to teach permaculture in countries of war and civil war. Then I was getting the experience of devastated lands. Countries like Vietnam had 30 million bomb holes, and they didn't have one power station, they didn't have one bridge. And then back to Afghanistan, where the food supplies were systematically destroyed. So looking at those impacts and seeing in those very hard conditions whether permaculture could make a difference is part of my thinking in this book. By the way, I'm not trying to sell you the book, I'm trying to indicate how I was thinking that the book would change in depth and to some degree scope.
So you've had quite a life. Some very unique experiences that a lot of people here today wouldn't have had and possibly would struggle to understand. Could you paint a picture of one of the refugee camps you've worked in and what you saw there?
Well, the refugee camps in Lesbos, people coming from Afghanistan and Yemen, and for some reason the Yemeni just got my heart, absolutely. They talked and they cried when they talked about the destruction of their fields and their farms. I mean, Jodie, you'd know, if you had to leave this place and it's destroyed by bombs and landmines, you'd be weeping when you got somewhere safe. It's inevitable. But their love of the land and their love of their fruits and their love of their climate and their landscape was so profound. And as they started to talk about what they had, which was rich and wonderful, the tears would roll down. So Lesbos was a camp, many camps on Lesbos, so that was their first European landing, and from there people were processed by the UN. Some people will spend 20 to 30 years in refugee camps, some of them will never leave. Lesbos, 1/3 of the population are refugees, and we keep a few hundred people locked on offshore islands. I mean, what's the danger? You know, they're not endangering Lesbos. So they're not, no one. It's just so strange, the whole attitude anyway. And in Lesbos, people are in these camps, and once you're in a camp, you're not necessarily safe. There are great dangers in camps. There are gangs and mafia. There are things run maybe by the Greek police or the Greek Air Force, Greek army, which can be anything from drugs to brothels. So we get people to design their tent or design their container, which they're living in. You have a family of 6 or 8 living in a container, and then you say to them, show me your design, and at great effort they've moved 2 or 3 together in a corral like this so they could sit on guard all night and keep themselves safe. That's the safety of a refugee camp in many cases. It's not. So hence the desire to often leave the camp and get somewhere else. And then the fires and the diseases that go through are really reprehensible. But let me tell you some results, because I think they're interesting. Each time, this has nothing to do with the book. Would you like me to go back to the book? I can, but I've just got off. You're keeping me in control. That's our bargain.
It's impossible.
And when we were running courses in the camps, they were advertised by local NGOs working in the camp and who invited me in. And we often didn't have a classroom. We were like the lost tribes, you know, under this tree and then there, and then in that bare place and then somewhere else, and sitting on a tarp in the hot ground. And we always invited some local people, if they were allowed in. The NGO staff had to be there, and refugees. When COVID hit, when the fires, someone burnt down the camp at Moria, and then they burnt down the day centre, people lost their documents and papers, and they were just walking all over the island, completely lost. The local people said, come here. It'd be like Jodie saying, come here, we'll find something for the moment, at least women and children, and keep you safe. So there were some really exciting things. We have a little bit of an idea. We include the NGOs, we include the locals, and we have the refugees. And especially if local people are farmers, they can then invite people. So there have been 2 fires, at least in Bangladesh at Cox's Bazar, been a couple of fires in Greece, we don't know why or how. Anyway, but the result is that these people work together in disasters to keep things going, and the successes have been enormous and breathtaking. So at the end of each course, we gave the NGO 2,000 Australian dollars, said, do what you like. It's yours. Tell us what you do. Now everyone said, they'll steal it, it'll be corrupt, they're all corrupt, you know, it won't work. We've had films made, we've had courses taught, we've had books translated, we've had seeds bought, we've had seeds planted, we've had more courses taught, we've had more people teaching. The range of things that people did to suit local conditions were outstanding. Now that takes me back to the book, because when I started the first book, I thought that permaculture was when you had 5 acres of land or a nice garden in the city where you put your lemon tree, your circular path, you did your walk, you compost your clothes and came back. I'm now dealing with a group of migrants in 50-storey buildings and living 8 in a room, and people living in the old ateliers in Paris and some of the most expensive arrondissements. I'm dealing with huge ranges of situations which we're calling people on the edges or the margins. And my thing was, will permaculture work for them? So in doing that, and the fact that 70% of people in the world are going to be living in cities in very crowded conditions, I reckon permaculture would die if it was just for those who had a bit of land and a nice house and garden. And very nice for them, but that's basically the Western middle class model. It's not even in Portugal. They all live in these little villages with these pretty cobblestones and no gardens and no food and increasingly no water. So the government said this year, okay, don't put your crops in the ground, the seed will just die and wasted, so they're not getting any crops this year. So I'm dealing with a world in which conditions are getting harder and people are going to be living differently, I think, from most of you. And in doing that, I tried to reflect it in the book but not make it the subject of the book. So that when I was looking at things such as, you know, try these at the end, there'd be something for someone who lives in an apartment. There'd be something for someone who might have a balcony garden. There'd be something for someone who lived in a crowded neighbourhood or a favela. as well as the people who have access to land. And the major change was always to alternate a little bit between those two, knowing that in the future more people are going to be on the crowded margins. Even if they're in a penthouse, they're still in the crowded margins. So that was a big influence. Mm.
And what led you to get into this work, Rowe? What's the backstory there?
Oh, I was in Lesotho, and I was an agricultural scientist. I went off to help the people, you know, full of helping, carrying my little bag of goodies, and as an agricultural scientist in Lesotho, I'd go and help them. Excuse me.
In Lesotho?
Lesotho?
Where's that?
Oh, in southern Africa. It's a little country like Switzerland. Has King Mshweshwe, and other interesting things about it. I think it's got a mounted police like Canada. And it's a little mountaintop completely enclosed by South Africa. And I can sing the first verse of the national anthem if pushed, but the rest I've forgotten. And while I was there, people were saying they've got to grow asparagus for the market. Asparagus is what's needed for these people to get an income and sell it to South Africa. I was going to the market one day and there were women sitting in their blankets as they, oh Jeff, sorry. Jeff and I have a little story going. Every time he wires me up for ASIO somewhere, I move or change it. I've lost it, Jeff, the ASIO thing. It's all right, is it? Okay, thanks. And I realised they had 3 tomatoes and an onion and a potato, and I stopped to talk and said, "What are you eating?" And they said, "We're selling this to get the flour from the maize flour." And I thought there's something very wrong about a system that provides for an export market before it provides for local families and people. That is most peculiar. And from then on, I was on the hunt for something else. But I also wanted to maintain natural systems. So eventually, after about 5 years there, I came back to Australia and learnt bush regeneration and horticulture and started teaching permaculture, rearranging the content but not changing the content much. It's my friend. And yeah, so that was sort of the way I got started. If there hadn't been permaculture, I would have been at a loss. And if there hadn't been ecology, there couldn't have been permaculture, because it revolves about ecosystems and the relationship between the soil and the water and the plant and the wind. And once you do the early bit, you have to consider them all together. That makes any engineers here, they get very unhappy because they want fixed variables. They want the wind to stay the same all year, temperature and speed. Then you can look at the soil. So it's really all these variables changing, which some of us love, I think, to think through the variability of the seasons and of life. So, yeah, and then I found permaculture, and within 12 months I'd been invited to go to Vietnam, where Australian government from Canberra had given about $200,000 to a place called Vacvina to do coffee growing. And I went there and said, hang on, we can do something better than this. The people are all hungry, thin as matchsticks, and the environment's all bombed and destroyed. Let's do something else. And then there was no fax and no phone except through Moscow, and you couldn't hear anything anyway. So, you know, you'd be in this phone box yelling, and someone in Moscow would be saying, ya, ya, da, da, and you'd think, you know. And I tried to ring Australia and get permission, and I didn't. So I just went ahead and taught them permaculture, and that project took off well. And by then I'd put a bit of a curriculum in place and felt I could teach it. And so it went through the whole place. FAO picked it up and we did some teaching. What was your question? Book.
How did you come to this work?
Well, there you are.
Yeah, I think you covered it quite well.
It's just a long way round, wasn't it? From southern Africa through to Vietnam. It's a long, long way.
Well, from the first permaculture courses that you started teaching, what happened between then and now? There's been a lot of experience.
Starting to look at the reality of people's lives. That was the thing that was happening. And looking at what people had done traditionally, particularly in this last book, what we might need in the future. So it was in places like Bangladesh that have the best disaster programs you could find, especially for floods, innovation, sea rise, cyclones. And we sort of think, well, let's send a disaster expert to Bangladesh. Come on, let's go to Bangladesh and learn what they do, which is all about community response, all about the community being prepared. And I was in Vietnam, there was this enormous cyclone. It was tragic, but I was in the area and I rushed out to help. Do you know what they did? They locked me in this classroom. They said, you stay there safe, you can't help. But they were sandbagging the beach, they were contacting everyone, they were doing everything, and the whole community knew exactly what to do. It was a tragedy, 12 people, fishermen and some boys were lost that night. So working on disaster, I realised that fast communication systems are the secret. It's interesting because Greta's friend Sarah is now disaster officer up in Byron Bay where they've had the big floods. And I spoke to Sarah the other day and said, how'd it go? She said, the government's hopeless. We've just got to work with our communities. Government can give us information. We know where each person is. We know where the resources are. We know where the children are. We know, and we're not allowed to set up an emergency place unless the government says from Sydney. And what we can do is actually set it all up ourselves. We know better places. So community empowerment is fundamental to disaster management. You know the access roads, the excess roads, the egress roads, the whole lot. So suddenly I started developing a whole new chapter on disasters that wasn't there. At that time I'd write to Bill Mollison and say, Bill, I want to do a chapter on this, what do you think? And he'd say, okay, go. So then I started adding some chapters. This book works a lot on understanding ecosystem health, because when I was in Tigris-Euphrates in northern Iraq, I was able to assess the unhealth of the ecosystem and therefore understand incrementally what was required to build it back to health. And that makes a big difference to know what you're looking at healthy soil, healthy canopies. I've been on a lovely drive through the Karri forest today, and I was looking at whether the canopy's burnt or recovering, what's happening with the bark, what's happening with the understory, and how fast and well some of those burnt forests are recovering. Because they're green, they're not recovered. There's a lot more to it. You stand and listen to the sound of the insects and the birds that should have been there. You're looking for the movement of things along the ground that should be there. It's still a pretty empty forest. And that's because the species that got lost are a multitude, and it's going to be 50 years perhaps before it recovers. And that brings up the bigger question of how do we live with fire? And you know, California has this. Portugal lost 80% of its fires. Its forests. And that was because they hadn't realised that their pine forests were a colonisation project 500 years ago. And because they've lived with pine forests for 500 years, they thought they were natural. People went back and searched all their early information and found the whole Iberian Peninsula should have been a range of Mediterranean oaks, insects, spiders, birds, soils, mycorrhiza, and different types of pigs and things that worked the ground. It should not have been the pine plantation. So that's been interesting for people, and they're thinking now to restore. In Greece, I was there a short time after most horrific fires. People actually died while they were in the Mediterranean Sea. I won't tell stories while children are here. And they were putting up memorials, and they decided instead of the pine forests, they were going to use a permaculture plan where the house was protected, the area around it was pretty wet, so using water to fight fire, and where they had systems of grey water and other water or wet mulch that could put out embers. So they're going to rebuild their pine forests as permaculture, because permaculture is greener and has different types of fire breaks. I'm off track. You're not doing your job. I don't know who appointed you.
I don't know either. Thinking of your work in different cultures, different countries, when you bring some of the messages behind permaculture and behind your work to people, how do different cultures relate to that message and how do they make it their own?
Oh, well, I wouldn't dare to tell people some things because I don't know. It would just be arrogant and stupid. So if I'm with a group of people in Africa, perhaps the Conso, I would say to them, we're going to talk about the kitchen garden. You want to be able to grow food all around. What are the limiting factors? And they're going to be water or nutrient, or the animals eat it at night. So we don't start till we've worked those out, obviously, because otherwise you're condemned to failure. And then I'd say to them, now form groups, and I want you to talk about the hardiest vegetables. Now those groups form a bigger group. So you see, I can't actually know what they're saying because they're working in language. Now those groups come and present on the board, then I'll put in the questions. When do you sow the seed? How do you clean the seed? How do you know it's viable seed? How do you know it will germinate? How do you, what time to fruiting? And I want you to list all the local varieties that you'd like to maintain and keep. So that's drawing attention to seed saving, range of stuff. So I really work with their knowledge, but directing their knowledge towards an understanding of what they've got. One big thing I've said several times here is the Rohingya, who are now in Cox's Bazar. I said to them, now would you please list your forest species? So 2 hours later they're still going. And then I said, will you now list the products? And I just had to cut that off because we were running out of time. And they had hundreds of products. And I realised they're not going to do a vegetable garden. They're going to get their products from trees, which makes sense when it's hot and wet and there's fungus and everything rots and everything eats it and it's full of insects. So therefore we go with what they do and how do you enrich those forests to have the fruit? How do you enrich them? Then I came back to Australia and said, how many eucalypts? 630. I said, list them all and their products. We got eucalyptus oil. What else did we get?
Firewood.
Firewood and some building timbers. And I thought, where's the eco-literacy in Australia? Where is it? It just isn't there. We don't have it. So we don't really understand. We're not in relationship at all with our environment. You can love it, but not be in relationship to the point of that familiarity, what you give it and it gives you. But anyway, I'm off track again. So that's the way we teach. But from Manila, I was able to pick up a place of cascading disasters in the Philippines. Volcano, earthquake, cyclone and typhoon, war in Marawi, and a dictator who rushes around and kills people. So they had multiple forms of disaster, and yet they are better organised than any place I've met. But what I did learn is after a few disasters, people become passive because there's no time to recover. And the other thing is I've used the word, but I don't think resilient is a concept anymore, because we're not going to resiliently spring back like a tennis ball. We are going to have to think really hard about how we adapt to the changing reality. And I think take on adaptation and keep asking, how do we adapt to the best we know, which is better for a range of circumstances. I'm now lecturing. No, stop me.
Also wanted to speak that there is deep knowledge of forest in Australia. It's just a lot of people aren't aware of that knowledge.
It is true, yes, okay. There's some wonderful people doing marvellous stuff in forests, and we need more people. My answer would be make everyone a citizen scientist and get them out there. You know, within half an hour out there, you love it. You either like the smell of something or the picture or the tiny flower and book.
So, back to the book.
Keeping me on track.
Couldn't help but notice that there's a foreword by the one and only Vandana Shiva.
Yeah.
How did that come about? And is this a sign that permaculture is gaining recognition globally?
Oh, permaculture's been recognised globally for a long, long time. It's just that many Australians don't know about it. So it's been practiced in one of the best monsoonal properties that's been going more than 40 years. It's in India near Hyderabad, which is absolutely stunning. Red lateritic soils with huge cracks in it over the years has been reclaimed, restored, rebuilt. It's absolutely sensational. So we've got long-term permaculture places that are now going through climate change and still giving us great yields. And, you know, India, permaculture's fabulous. You teach a permaculture group and they go out and say, I'm going off to teach people in the northwest, and I'm going off to teach people here, and I'm going to the Sunderlands to teach people, and they're almost out the door by the end of the course. Now, at the other end, have we got any French people here? Oh, see, 6 years of philosophy, and they say instead, I'm thinking about that. I don't know if I want to do it. I'm not sure if I'm meant to do it, and I'm not sure if the feeling is there to do it. But the Indians are fantastic. They just get out and go for it. Yeah, I'm off track.
That's okay. We'll just make peace with that.
Yeah, but look, some of the things I thought were needed: a real move to ecosystems, move from me to we. We have to look. Hello, Tilia. We have to move from I and my place to we and our place. We have to really think of ourselves as groups. And I think that's very, very important.
There's some images in the book. And I know you've got a long working relationship with Rob Allsop, the book illustrator.
Yeah.
Shine a bit of light on that for us. How does he get into your brain and get those images on the page?
Well, with the first book, Rob lived next door, and I'd write a chapter, Rob would draw, come in, we'd talk about it, and the drawings look folksy, they're actually accurate. You know, so if you want a windbreak, it's leaf to the ground. It's not a tree that looks like a lollipop because the wind goes under. If we're talking about carbon under the soil, it is accurate. If we're looking at the way CO2 moves from from land to sea, it's accurate. What Rob's done this time is provide some lovely drawings of, say, a marine ecosystem. Because most people don't understand enough about the ocean grasses and the kelp forests, which are vast, and the species that live there and what they require. And yet everything we do on land ends up on the sea, somewhere, in the air or over 1,000 years. And we talk about there only being one ocean. And it takes 750 to 1,000 years to go around the world and come back. So we're looking at drawings which speak to people. We present a natural profile of a water cycle from the snow, where the snow's subliming, through to the wetlands, through to the hanging swamps, coming down, grasslands, forests, wetlands by the sea, and then the sea, and then the disturbed landscape. And you can give that to people and say, where do I intervene? What part do I live in? Well, how can I be effective for my place in the landscape? So Rob's done some really lovely drawings, and he's agonised over them a lot about getting them correct. But the other thing is they scale up beautifully, and they also, the captions can easily be removed and put into another language.
Did he suffer making the drawings with you?
Did you suffer making drawings for David? Excuse me, this is private. Don't listen.
Yes.
Yes, I think you did. I think there were moments where I think perhaps everything went out the window. And everything was drawn by hand on paper first. Every last thing was put onto paper and tested and submitted. I tried to be, and he's a great researcher. So Rob would research and research and research for hours and hours, and the drawings look fat. But you know, he did a fantastic job. You're the new generation, and the generation is from Andrew Jeeves in black and white, through to some early books in black and white, through to black and white, and then we've got your books and your beautiful illustration. You capture concepts again and again. Oh, we're on to Greg. We're on to Brenna. This one.
Co-teacher Brenna and Greta, it was quite confusing.
So we ended up with one name, which was either Bretta or Grenna.
For those who don't know, Andrew Jeeves is the illustrator of the Permaculture Designer's Manual, worked with Bill Mollison.
And he's written a hilarious article, or you interviewed him for it, and what it was like working for Bill. I'm afraid we'll have to wait for a while, and then you'll tell us what it's like working for David.
One day.
One day.
One day.
Okay, but the illustrator is very important because you read your text, and is the illustration there? Is it appropriate to have an illustration? Sometimes it's not, sometimes you say, just look at the illustration and you don't have to write text. So it really is a careful play of a duet, and the artist is as important as the author in all this. I'm sorry Rob's not here, he's a lovely guy. Yeah.
How did you decide to make an updated version? What was the process and what was the catalyst for that?
COVID. I came back from the Philippines and suddenly there were no flights in and no flights out, and I thought, this is the moment, I'm ready. And so I just sat down, wrote through COVID. 2 years later, day after day of writing and rewriting and checking, and then gradually getting it. In some ways, it's a book. I always like to write for need. So this first book I felt was necessary in a way to interpret people who didn't want to wade through Bill's books. And at that stage, neither Bill or David ever wanted an editor. And I think an editor's your best friend, because they see things and they're clear and they can just relate. And so in that first book I simply rearranged the materials in a way that eco-literacy came first. You could look at a landscape and look at the vegetation, look at the soils and water, and then when you came to design, you brought them all together and you could design a piece of land. So that was the way I was thinking. When I got to this book, I realised that the subject of permaculture, which is most difficult, is that of patterns in nature. And if you get it, it will take you straight into landscape reading and landscape analysis. Because all landscapes have a climax vegetation. A desert, you know, the spinifex, and then you can get your grasslands, and then you get your open woodlands until you get your forest, but it's a climax vegetation. If you look a part of that destroyed, you have to know what you're revegetating back to, even if you're using other species. So that when I'm in New South Wales with this sort of rainfall, the vegetation looks similar, but it's different species, because climate tends to shape, the climate and evolution tends to shape things, the function of that place. So you wouldn't try to green the desert, because you're going to badly stuff up climates in India. Neither are you going to cut down forests and turn them into grassland, because you're going to wreck a whole series of water and rain that falls across the world in the bigger patterns. So understanding where you are, whether it's a hillside or a garden, and knowing what's appropriate. And that's all about pattern language, whether you're on contours or you're going out laterally. And I don't know whether I've done it, but that was the topic I worked hardest on. And we call that what order of landscape according to permanence, and what pattern do you impose on the landscape. Is it a circle? Is it a spiral? When? Where? Is it a branching pattern? How's that going to work? So that was something I thought if people could get it, and any of you who have read it, I'd love some feedback on that. But it isn't a matter of, isn't this leaf beautiful and isn't that one lovely and doesn't that flower smell sweet? It's much more about a really hard understanding of degradation. You should be able to look at a river and know whether it's restoring its place. And that's what I put in whole chapter: environmental water, wetlands, hanging swamps, bores, wells, underground water. I wouldn't accept anyone's plan today unless they've got a plan to put water back into the ground. Really, unless they're recharging groundwater, I'll say, would you please go back and show me how you plan to put any surplus water back into the water table? Because it's a worldwide program, a problem. From Indonesia, everywhere, the groundwater is being depleted, and as it becomes depleted, it turns toxic. It can either end up with a lot of arsenic or a lot of nitrogen or something. So when I was a child, I grew up in Dalkeith and Dirt Road and bush next door and spider orchids and donkey orchids. I'm one of you. I grew up not in Sandgroper, and a lot of houses just had watering systems pumping out of the water table to keep the grass looking green. You know, you go to Canberra, they've learnt, where it changes colour with the seasons. It goes sort of brown and gold and wheat coloured through summer, and then green again with spring, and you've got these lovely shades passing over the landscape, which are Australian. Sure, you probably want a bit of grass, but really that's often a bit of cultural cringe. I don't know where we got the idea that, you know, a golf course is more beautiful than a paddock of golden, lovely Australian. I'm off track. This is why you have an interviewer.
So, Rowe, what's your process for writing? How do you research? How do you get your ideas on the page?
I do a lot of research, and I'm very, very interested in what's coming. I'm only evidence-based, and occasionally my experience, but I try to keep some of that out because it's not valid to lead with I think and my opinion is and you should all and why don't you. I think you have to be able to depend on the evidence in a book, and for some people who translate it, they may not have anything else to go to at all. So if the book isn't accurate and they can't read English, they won't, you know, that is a deceit. So I'm very, very keen. Then it has to be appropriate. I don't want people distracted by stuff. I think that's interesting, so I'll put it in. It needs to be relevant. So there's quite a lot of interesting work on soils at the moment, and that I think could go in. So it's really evidence and approach. So some of the chapters I put in, a full chapter on environmental water, because it's so endangered at the moment. A full chapter on forests other than indigenous forests. So with that we're looking at things such as contour forests and shelter belts and forests along rivers and forests along different areas where they need to go back to protect that particular ecosystem or space or act as a buffer. I mean, the Dutch have planted, I think, 100,000 trees along their polders simply to be able to hold the water back a little bit, while many of the Dutch are buying country in in Portugal and Spain, which is not such a good idea, considering lots of people think the Sahara is now moving into the Iberian Peninsula, and they could plant massively trees over their wet season. They've probably got 2 or 3 years to do it, but there's not enough political will. So a whole lot about water and water interventions and water systems, but not really that much on little techniques because they tend to be regional. I've divided soils into theory of soils and then repairing soils, how to do it if you want your kitchen garden, what you do if you're in an orchard, what you do if you're in large space, how can you repair soils, how do you know a healthy soil, what state is the soil in, what do you need to do. It's a lot of this question and answer stuff. In the case of water, after talking to the Portuguese in a class, they've decided no more dams, which would be such a shock to all of us who have grown up on yeomans and quay lines and putting dams in, or if you do, make your dam the ecosystem. So that's reeds, it's windbreaks, it's filter reed beds, and it's water on your stock somewhere else. So every dam becomes a beautiful ecosystem which is protected from the evaporation. Why? Because you have to build it 7 times as big as the water you'll use, because that's how much will be evaporated. And therefore, is it worth it to try and build these big open systems that are going to dry out quickly? If you're going to build dams, at least deeper, with smaller surface areas and highly protected by vegetation, which is a different way of feeding and working. It doesn't mean you won't rip your land or you mightn't put in swales. It's just that those open, well, really muddy holes, you know, we see them all over Australia, muddy holes at the bottom of the hill with a cow standing up to its gut peeing in it. That's the state of most in Australia. We need to change the thinking to become ecosystems which are productive, also wildlife, and move to greener solutions and less single factor, this will hold water like a tank, but this needs to be an ecosystem. So I don't know, water is of course a subject that's going to preoccupy us all from now till the rest of our lives. Too much, too little, too cold, too late, too early, and if you're a permaculture designer, your skill will be on how you manage water, more than almost anything else, I think.
We've been talking quite big picture about permaculture thinking, but how do you apply permaculture thinking in your life in the Blue Mountains?
Oh, I'm completely colonised in the brain. I mean, years of thinking permaculture, it colonises your brain. Beware. If you haven't done a course, it can happen to you. So that I'll be doing something and I think, am I working where it counts? No. I'm going to do something I really want done and get it done, and that'll be done. And then in another way it's critically important is that somewhere when you're thinking in terms of grievance and problems, but the politicians never do anything and they won't act, you have to think in terms of solutions. It's a basic permaculture principle. Think of solutions. And I'm really, really hard for people who come up and say, did you read the paper that they're cutting down this? And I say, well, what are you doing? And they say, yes, but it's in the paper. I say, yeah, but what's your response to that? What are you doing? In other words, that solution that you give might be a protest letter, or it might be sign of something, it might be hang a thing, or it might be plant a tree. But the moment you operate on solutions, first of all, you increase your power, and secondly, people feel better. It's a really important way to think. Awful lot of people have got grievance mentality, think, doesn't it? You know, and the climate's changing and their life won't be on Earth and it'll be dreadful for the children and this will be turned into a desert and let's go and eat worms. Right. The alternative is, well, I'm here with solutions. I'm going to do what I can do, and even if it's not everything, it's what I can do. Don't try to do it all. It's too hard. All I can do is teach and write a bit. I can't do much more. But I'm also now very keen on getting to local council because the unit of design and survival is going to be local government. Call it your bioregion, call it what you want. It's the most responsive government we've got, regardless of where they are on the spectrum of progressive to conservative, men in suits. But that whole thing, and you can make them hear, and you can speak to your local person, and you can get things passed, and you can get a lobby group going, and you can make up a letterhead of 6 people and keep telling council what you want. You can have intervention into local plans. The local government is the one that's going to be surviving, and where it's cities, it's some cities. Sustainable cities are great. And there are some wonderful cities, strangely enough, including Paris. So they're turning parks into gardens, they're turning wide park roads into something, they're turning parking lots into different things. Sustainable cities, and the mayors of those cities all talk to each other, and they're often ahead of the state government and way ahead of the federal. So there are places and people to watch for the most exciting development.
There's a rumour, Rowe, little bluebirds have been telling us.
They're all outside now, though.
That you're retiring,
yeah, I am.
In a sense. What does that mean?
I'm going home and I'm going to go to bed and I'm going to drink lots of cups of sweet, milky tea, what old ladies do. And then I'm going to get a rocking chair and I'm going to sit and I'm going to knit booties. I've got it all worked out. Because I've got you, and there's Charlie, and there's all the class who are here this week, and there's Greta, and there's Pippa. They're all of you who can easily just move in and do whatever you like in your own space. You know, this sort of building your succession model, we've got this place, they've got a terrific vision for the future as training centres, we've got people going out to teach. Yeah, I think, you know, I can just sit back and that's it. A little brandy sometimes. Or some of Jeff's beer. Yeah, so, yeah, I have to stop. The problem is can always see potential in something, and often I can't see the steps to get there. And that is a great difficulty because you take on big projects. Anyone else like that? You can see this and you'd love to do it and you say yes and suddenly you find, my God, I didn't know. And you're stuck with it. It's terrible. Terrible. Okay. Questions?
With retirement in mind,
yeah.
What are you working on at the moment?
Well, funny you should ask. Vietnamese have gardened, actually gardened, not been farmers but been gardeners for 3,000 years, And for about 13 years I've collected the different ecosystems and the styles of gardens and how they've gardened and what they've done. I've got all the photos and I've got the formatting. I just have to rewrite all the chapters and then I'll retire.
Hold you to it. All right, final question. This book, Rowe, how does it serve the future? How does this take the conversation forward?
I really had it all the time, would this book be useful in a decade? Would this book be useful when things have changed? I don't think it's any good writing a book for now. So a lot of the questions and the thinking and the information is to cover situations in the future. So for example, there are water systems from the Middle East which are nearly all underground and very, very interesting, and in which, here's something for Australia, all the houses have a central courtyard, so they're square, and the roofs slope inward with gutters, and they drop into a big cistern in the middle where the water stays cool and clean forever. Why do we tip our roofs outward to catch the water and run it away? Because we're colonial Australians. Oh, that dog. Colonial Australians, and that's what the English or the French or the someone did. If we had been settled by people from the Middle East, our water conservation would have been transformed. Absolutely different. And I just think that we need to be looking at what people do in areas, the marsh Arabs who farm in wetlands and wet areas. I think we need that. I think we need to feed in a lot more, not because it's cute, not because it's cultural romance of what they do is fascinating and isn't that marvellous, but because some of these things will be needed in the future, you know, I think, and it's just putting the idea there, and maybe in 20, 30 years you might say, I saw a drawing of that once by Rob and I'd like to look at it again. But it is time to change some of the way we're thinking about things. I was trying always to think of the future.
Thanks, Rob.
Of the children who are here today.
So we've got time for a couple of questions and then we can move outside, and while we're eating, Ro will be there so you can come and approach her with other questions if you'd like. Have we got some questions here in the group now? Mark?
You always tell us as teachers to not put our own opinions in, and you mentioned that you weren't putting any opinions, or maybe about the future, into the new edition. What opinion would you like to share? If someone said, like me, what is the most opinionated thing that you can say? I've always been curious.
I'd rather talk about experience,
Yeah?
because experience mightn't be general and universal, but at least it's true, whereas opinions...
From your experience?
From my experience, start thinking of adaptation now. Don't even think of resilience, because as we know in Tenterfield already in New South Wales, the mice, the fires, the drought, the flood, then COVID, and people are becoming passive under the battery of constant disasters. So the more you prepare now, the better you're going to be. And preparing as a community is absolutely essential. You could take that chapter in my book and turn it into community education, and you'd all be pretty well fitted to deal with some of the more serious things. But otherwise, your environment. And I'd be fighting fire with water more than perhaps just removing vegetation, because we need vegetation if we get drier. Filter the dust, slow the wind, cool the air. If we don't have trees, we are going to suffer like mad. We've just turned the place into a desert because we think a tree will catch fire. We have to be more creative than that. And so, you know, there are lots of questions. My advice and it is my opinion, start now, really quickly, and think of adaptation. And I'd read a few things about the IPCC, International Panel of Climate Change.
Intergovernmental panel.
Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, and what are they saying about this region? Because we know that a lot of the rain-bearing winds are going to miss every now and again. The rain-bearing winds are moving further south, so the monsoon from the Kimberleys is actually falling in New South Wales at the moment. I mean, it's ridiculous. but the winds and the wind patterns are changing. How can you adapt to this changing future? And what are the you need massive diversity in plants and gardens and everything. You need protective systems in water and plants. You need a really strong community. You don't have to love each other, but you need to be prepared to work together. Really, we don't have to love each other. We really can work together and listen to each other's, values and abilities and all that, and put it together into a strong system. Oh, that's my friend. When they're not snoring, I'm snoring. It's one of us.
So is there a chapter on exactly that?
Yeah, there's one on disasters, but I also looked at money very, very closely, looking at the donut, looked at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and there's 160 techniques and strategies for each development goal. Pull out one on water, look what will suit you, choose it, get your council to recommend it, back it and support workshops and things in the area. I just think we can't go ahead of that. And the SDGs and also the planetary boundaries. So Holmgren and Mollison in 1971 put up global problems, and now in nearly 2020 we've got planetary boundaries which are almost identical. Deforestation, drinking water, soil loss, they're just about perfectly there, except now they're cascading. So we really have to move into action and consider things we do that count. And we're going to look for models of places like this. We've got so many innovative thinkers and really people prepared to step out and do things in the Margaret River area that you could be leaders. We've got to have models, and this sort of area is likely to be a model because you've got the courage and you've got the creativity to do it. And the sense of community. I mean, you walked in tonight, everyone's talking to each other. Well, some people talk to other people, but you also there was that recognition of us rather than I, not individuals sitting down, not feeling part of us. So develop that sense of stronger belonging, this is us and this is the way we are. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
Had a question up the back from Mark.
This is a pretty big read, Rosemary. And for a lot of people in normal society, it'd be quite hard for them to digest a lot of that. And a lot of people here are sort of, in the field, and we're kind of, converted, I suppose. So I'm just sort of wondering if you've got any thoughts about how, we can maybe make it accessible and also just try and sort of get the word out a bit wider. Besides Charlie singing songs on the street. All right now about it.
What's the question?
Or you could answer it, Charlie.
The book out more widely?
So how can we spread the word to other people who maybe aren't thinking this way?
And not thinking permaculture already, just trying to have you got any thoughts about how, you talked a little bit about setting up examples and things like that. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts about
Look, just start doing it. And they'll be immensely curious. Yeah, just get on with it. And that's largely my subject of conversation. Haven't got much else left except, and I'm increasingly in love with the environment. I have been so deeply, deeply satisfied and rewarded being here this week by the little blue wrens, and I haven't seen the little magpie for years, and the parrots, and you think they're here. They've got to be kept here. They're absolutely fabulous. That Chief Seattle said, without animals we'd die from a great loneliness of spirit. And really it's true. I've been through places with no plants and no animals, and your spirit gets very lonely, whatever your spirit is. As for spreading it, well, I don't know. You could have a book reading. I don't know. You could offer people a chapter. I have no idea.
Receptivity where you've been in places where it's obviously a lot more marginal, people are a lot more ready.
Yeah, they're ready to jump in. They'd go home in the evening and do it and come back next day and say, I've got that happening, I've got it tried. And that's because their lives are so much more vulnerable. But gradually, the props and the supports of our life are being pulled away by disasters. And there's no way that government supports will be there for all the people at all times. It got really bad. So we need this community resilience, and you'll do a better job. If you're waiting for the government to find you a refuge centre in a flood, that's not their priority. But if you locate one and tell people, everyone knows it's a primary school with water tanks, a school garden, and teachers will be there to look after the kids. You know, that sort of thing. So, yeah. And then the other thing, making land available to people and getting some really nice community stuff happening that people love being together. You always need a ukulele.
One more question?
Can I ask, you said about models, you said about eco-literacy, you said about children. In your experience, what model was effective that we can follow or to achieve eco-literacy? In your experience, like, you know, how do we learn more, become more eco-literate?
Right, so by practicing and going on and reading, but what makes it successful, I think I found in Vietnam, 60% had an idea, 30% in a village would learn, 60% would be interested at the end of 2 years, 90% were doing something. They were doing something. Now that's everything from insulating a house, doing water tanks, doing grey water, to putting in, you know, a garden or a fruit tree. And that's all you need really to get critical mass. And there's a critical mass at which you recognise. There's no one model because there are too many different environments. A refugee camp is such a different model from Margaret River. Yeah.
And Rowe, you've skirted around it but haven't named it. To cap off, what are your thoughts on the value of Indigenous knowledges in this country and others and how that overlaps?
I think one of the big things for me is where not all places have Indigenous knowledge. So the first Iberian tribes in Spain and Portugal, that was genocide by the Greeks, 3000 BC. So insofar as Indigenous peoples are concerned, that history of genocide's gone on a long, long time. And there are places where there are not Indigenous people. What I find, and I'd rather use a principle here than details, is wherever the landscape, and I mean the water, the soils, the biodiversity is preserved and cared for, people have a relationship. It's not we are guardians, and it's not we are custodians, and not we are wardens. It is we are in relationship with the land, the trees, the soil, and we're conscious of them all the time. We're outside, and we constantly relate. And that means you can't sit inside on your computer all day and you can't look at your phone. You have to take time out to be in relationship and ask questions about what would I fight for, what would I live for, what do I want more of, what can I keep, what do I care about. Unless you're in relationship, you may not act. And so those Indigenous Australians, the Bishnoi people of the Rajasthan desert who died protecting trees. There are numbers of people around the world, but not all ethnic groups have really maintained a strong, strong connection. And the major thing is always, I'm in relationship with all life, including the stars. And I think that's where we learn to get into that relationship, so you care about the ants and even the leeches, if necessary. That, you know, our relationship is with all life. It's not just this human-to-human thing. And seeing ourselves as much smaller, potentially dangerous, and much smaller in the landscape and our actions. That mightn't be satisfying because there are all sorts of interesting things about different Indigenous groups when I've been lucky enough to meet them or live with them, like the saltwater people in Solomon Islands who live on a sand spit and how they harvest the sea for firewood and things. It's all wonderful, but ultimately they're in a deep relationship with the ocean and the lagoon at every moment of the day. We should be sitting outside talking, and we should stop before the sun goes and go and get into some relationships.
Sure. Rowe, this is an important book, a progressive book, and it's one of the vital tools taking us into uncertain futures. Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight.
Thank you, Brenna. Come on.